It's probably one of the certainly memorable times where she encounters kind of naked racism, because one of the bubbles of being on a largely segregated side of a city is that you don't encounter a lot of white folks.
That's exactly right. And she's very circumspect about whether she personally encountered racial hostility at Princeton and Harvard, or at least what we would consider as kind of overt racism, while obviously structurally and personally it was challenging. And it was a time, remember the Bakke decision was 1978, she's arriving in 81, and then moving on to Harvard, where Elena Kagan, now in the Supreme Court, said all the talk at that point was turning to race. And I was lucky enough that many of Michelle's friends at Princeton and Harvard shared their stories with me. And they talked about how the conversation was about not just what, as African Americans, Michelle and her friends were encountering, but structurally, what could they do to make a difference? You know, it sounds maybe earnest or in some contexts maybe cheesy, but to a person, her friend said, we wondered at Harvard, for example, what can law accomplish? How can things change? What is the role of a lawyer? What is the role of a black lawyer? Remembering, too, that this was a time of Derek Bell, critical
race theory.
Critical race theory was very much on the table. It was also Reagan. It was the Reagan era. And think of all that was going on in terms of...
She arrives at Princeton at the height of the right's arrival or resurgence with the election.
It really does. And this is the time of Bork. This is when Clarence Thomas is running the EEOC. This is when Reagan announces his candidacy for president in Neshoba County, Mississippi. I mean, this stuff was very much on the surface, and she needed to decide what role she would play at Harvard, for example, and beyond that, of course, what she would do with her career.
So just because it's a resonant moment, and there are likely either in the audience, perhaps young people headed off to college soon, in college, or parents of them, and certainly in our live stream audience. So we've seen in the last 24 months a film, Dear White People. We've seen social media activists create hashtags such as I too am Harvard, similar hashtags at the University of Michigan, as well as at Georgetown University, really speaking to a millennial's generational response to the very same kinds of dynamics that Michelle Obama experienced 30 years ago. And what's fascinating is it may not be obvious in her position as First Lady for those who don't know her personally, but she quickly allied herself with a kind of infrastructure of black student activism at Princeton, including the Third World Center. Imagine that.
That's right. The name of which has now changed, one might point out. But it was the Third World Center. Craig worked there as a DJ. It was on the street where all the clubs were, right around the corner from the selective eating clubs that were overwhelmingly white, of course, as was Princeton. And she, one of her friends said that there was something called a Black Thoughts table, for example. There was an organization that also brought in Black Unity that brought in speakers, and she had to decide exactly where she would place herself on the spectrum, choosing not just how she was going to relate with white classmates, but also with a great array of black classmates.
In fact, I'd even say that in your own work, you describe that she's not just sort of moving in and out of these spaces, because there are students that you interviewed who were uncomfortable with what was becoming a kind of expectation of how one wore their identity on their sleeve and what one's politics were. And Michelle was less conflicted about this than others, partly, I think, as you write, because her family history had not shielded her from the legacies of racism and understanding it, and so she was processing organizationally.
She very much was. I spoke with Ruth Simmons, who went on, who was a Princeton professor and administrator who went on to be the president of Smith and the president of Brown University. And she said not only did students like Michelle have to make these decisions, but so did faculty. It was a very charged time.
Yeah. And one last note about Princeton. We know, of course, that Sonia Sotomayor, Bronx native, goes to Princeton. and also talks about how important it was for her to be at Princeton as a function of affirmative action and to embrace her Latino-ness in her capacity as a Supreme Court justice. So in some ways, it's something about the place and its southernness that actually helped to forge racial identities in ways that they might have been more ambiguous if the place hadn't been, in some ways, as hostile as it was.
I think that's right, and that's exactly what Michelle found in her thesis. She was a sociology major with a minor in African American studies, and she set out to ask some questions that I think are revealing of what she was wrestling with at the time, in addition to what the times were. And broadly, she was trying to figure out, she interviewed, sent out questionnaires to dozens of black graduates of Princeton, asking them how they considered their blackness and their relationship to a variety of parts of the black community before they got to Princeton, while they were at Princeton, and after. And she said one of the great surprises of her research was that they felt more connected to being a black person while they were there, and which very much supports that.
No, I think it's an incredibly rich story and moment for her. Not least of which because she really is thinking out loud and acting in terms of her academic study on the responsibility of someone with privilege. That is a formative question for her that she's working out in a formal sense. It's not just as if she opts in or opts out. In some ways, it defines who she is by this time.
I think one could argue that it not only defined who she was at the time, it defines who she is now.